Good evening, I'm Peter Mansbridge. 1984 was one of the most eventful years in the history of Canada. It was the year everything seemed to happen. A papal visit, a royal visit, a visit by a Canadian to space. We got a new Prime Minister, two in fact, a new Governor General, and a renewed sense of national pride after a spectacular showing by our athletes at the Summer Olympics. We'll relive those moments in the next 90 minutes. And in a world of change, we'll remember the stories that made headlines in 1984. Famine in Ethiopia, assassination in India, the Reagan re-election in the United States. We'll also consider the challenges of 1984, including one unique to this year, the challenge of defying the vision of George Orwell. That's where Larry Stout begins his look at the lifestyles of 1984.
1984. This was George Orwell's warning. A society presided over by Big Brother, a society without joy and love, a society of dreary conformity. This is a scene from the latest movie version of the classic doomsday novel.
Excuse me, brother. You dropped your ink pencil.
Thanks, sister.
What about the real 1984? There was indeed concern about big government, about bad news being painted as good, about computers invading our privacy. But we survived this benchmark year with our individuality intact. Or did we? One person to do so was Boy George. The British rock star didn't exactly start a trend toward androgyny, but his boy-girl act did have some interesting counterparts during the year. There was gender bending in the fashion world. For one thing, women began wearing men's underwear, some of them complete with flies, would you believe? And at a Paris fashion show, men turned up in skirts. It didn't exactly start a worldwide trend, but what's popular in Paris one year can be the rage in Toronto or New York the next. And still with fashion, the most popular women's footwear of the year, jellies, plastic shoes. As for conformity, well, this is called the wave. Stand after stand of cheering people. Thank heaven it took place at sporting events, not political rallies. Michael Jackson was again the most popular entertainer in 1984. His North American tour became mired in foul-ups, broken engagements, and lawsuits, but wherever he went, he was a sellout. This performer, Prince, challenged Jackson for mass appeal and cult followers in 1984. Critics and some religious leaders branded his act vulgar and bordering on the obscene.
Canada, we are the nation's music station.
Prince and Michael Jackson were also part of the music video revolution. Whether on pay TV or regular channels, music videos were the rage.
Television network.
In Canada, more than half the available teenage audience watched the weekly CBC music video series, Video Hits and Good Rockin' Tonight.
And welcome to Video Hits.
But the young were not just passive watchers. Breakdancing became a street corner phenomenon across North America. The Queen was rather bemused when she watched some young people demonstrate their bone-rattling pirouettes during a visit to Fredericton, New Brunswick. There was another new prince for the royal family.
The world's people have waited to congratulate the Princess Diana, who has issued forth with a second child. It is a boy.
The Princess of Wales gave birth to a second son, Prince Henry Charles Albert David. She and Prince Charles said their new son, third in line to the throne, would be known to family and friends as just plain Harry.
Lotto 649.
And some of the biggest prizes ever were won. In January, Stuart Kelly and his wife Lillian of Brantford, Ontario, won a Lotto 649 jackpot worth nearly $14 million. Tragically, 6 months later, Stuart Kelly died of cancer. And in the United States, this man, Michael Witkowski, won the largest lottery jackpot ever, a whopping $40 million in the Illinois State Lottery. Medical science continued to develop revolutionary new techniques. Not all were initially successful. This month-old infant, baby Faye, received a baboon's heart to replace her own congenitally deformed one. She rallied briefly, but 3 weeks after the historic operation, she died. William Schrader became the second recipient of a portable mechanical heart. He later suffered a slight stroke.
How are you tonight? Hi. Anything to drink tonight?
Deaths, unnecessary deaths on the roads caused by drinking drivers, became the target of a major campaign against drunk driving in 1984. Some provinces banned so-called happy hours when drinks could be bought more cheaply. The federal government promised tougher drunk driving laws. It was neither an accident nor drunk driving that resulted in this man's scars. They were self-inflicted, suffered when he tumbled over Niagara Falls in a barrel. His name is Carl Suchak, and he became just the 5th person ever to successfully ride over the Horseshoe Falls, 1984's Stunt of the Year. So what about George Orwell's warnings? They certainly remain valid. Individuality continues to compete with conformity, freedom with totalitarianism. But in 1984, we could still find joy. We could still have fun. We could still ask,
where's the beef?
1984 was a special year in Canadian politics. For the first time this century, we had 3 prime ministers in the same year. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, John Napier Turner, Martin Bryan Mulroney. The story of how we got from the first to the third, from Trudeau to Mulroney, begins with the story of how we got from Trudeau to Turner. It's the story of the end of an era and the struggle by Liberals to start another. Jason Moskowitz takes us back.
It was a bitterly cold day in February. Parliament was silent and empty. The House of Commons wasn't sitting that week. There wasn't even anyone around to spread any Trudeau resignation rumors. It wasn't supposed to happen that week, but true to form, Trudeau surprised everyone.
And I noted myself the date and thought, 29th of February, we should have known.
On most days, Trudeau absolutely loathed talking to reporters, but on this day, he delighted telling them all the big story, the whole story, his story.
I went to judo with my boys. And, a very good judo lesson because nobody was there because of the storm, so we had to teach it all to ourselves. And I went home, discussed with the boys, put them to bed, walked till midnight in the storm. Interesting, eh? And then I went home and took a sauna for even an hour and a half. It was all clear. I was going to leave, but I went to sleep just in case I'd change my mind overnight, and I didn't. I woke up. It was great. I use the old cliche, this is the first day of the rest of my life. Here we are.
After 16 years, Trudeau was leaving. The scramble to succeed him was on. The prize, the prime ministership. All eyes were on one man.
Any decision to return to public life is a very serious one.
John Turner was holidaying in Jamaica. He didn't say he was in the race, but he couldn't hide the fact he was preparing for it. He had thinned down considerably. He appeared to be in great shape. John Turner looked and acted like a candidate. Jean Chrétien looked and acted like a worried man. He had put in more than 20 years' service to the Liberal Party, but many Liberals believed after Trudeau it was the turn of an English Canadian to be leader. And before a delegate was even chosen, they were saying thanks, but no thanks to the man from Shawinigan.
21 years, a lot of rubber chicken in my body, you know, a lot of speeches here and there, and I don't want to have the aggravation of a leadership race, the stress on the family, and the danger for the bank account that I don't have.
Jean Chrétien came close to not running, but his wife Aileen convinced him he had to run or he'd always wonder what might have been. With the decision taken, he told his supporters something that symbolized his campaign right to the end.
Alors, fasten your seatbelt. It's going to be a hell of a ride. Let's go.
When he declared his candidacy, John Turner disappeared every once in a while to get a drink of water. There was an awkwardness there, a rustiness in style as well as in policy. He came back as the crown prince, but this prince would have his problems.
I'm going to, as other candidates are doing, direct this campaign to the future, and I'm not going to resurrect the past.
There were other candidates in the leadership race. None of them was ever given a chance. None of them ever had a chance. The Liberal Party, which was so far down in the polls, organized policy forums across the country to try to gain back favor with the voters. But overall, there have been more exciting leadership races than this one.
Here he comes! Here he comes! How about that?
What life there was came from Jean Chrétien. He was setting the fires with an exciting, colorful, gutsy campaign. He was the big underdog scrapping away. He drove himself to total exhaustion, but he never allowed himself to give up.
It's what I call leadership. To inspire the people, to challenge them to go to higher peaks, because it is what Canada can achieve.
John Turner continued on.
So that no future government of another political stripe will dismantle or tinker or destroy what we in this party have built.
There were cracks in the armament, but the party establishment had made up its mind John Turner could win the next election, and nothing was going to stand in the way of his victory. The Liberals flocked to the Ottawa Civic Centre like the Conservatives had done the June before. They said goodbye to Trudeau on opening night, and no one missed him the next morning. The Liberals were preparing to give themselves a new leader, and the party establishment went to work. On the day of the vote, Alan McEachern went from neutral to Turner's box. Another neutral heavyweight was Marc Lalonde, who was ready to go to Turner on the second ballot if needed. It wasn't.
Chrétien, 1,067.
Chrétien, 1067.
Turner, 1,593.
Turner, 1595.
For Jean Chrétien, defeat was inevitable after the first ballot. He didn't have enough votes to catch John Turner. Everyone knew it, but Jean Chrétien wouldn't show it.
You know, when I'm trapped in a tough situation, here I go. I fight all the time.
Turner, 1,862.
John Turner was the winner, but his own party president told the country his victory wasn't that complete.
The man who came second but first in our hearts, Jean Chrétien.
But Turner won their votes, and that's all he needed to become prime minister. Every key position in his cabinet was held by the old Trudeau Guard. Turner had promised change, but hadn't delivered. The day he became prime minister, he had a 10-point lead in the Gallup poll. He also had a patronage deal in his pocket, thanks to an arrangement he had made with Trudeau.
The Department of External Affairs has apologized to the Portuguese government for this departure from international precedent.
As for what he actually thought of Bryce Mackesy going to Portugal,
well, he's our candidate.
But in those heady days of June, victory seemed possible. Turner went off to London to ask the Queen to postpone her trip to Canada to make way for an election.
The Queen agreed to postpone her visit, and John Turner called an early election, a summer election. That was just his first mistake. The Liberals made many more. The CBC's chief political correspondent, David Halton, takes us through Campaign 84, the humiliation of John Turner, the euphoric triumph of Brian Mulroney.
The 1984 election, more than the saga of Brian Mulroney's victory, it was the chronicle of John Turner's fall from grace. Never before had a Canadian Prime Minister destroyed himself so quickly.
All right. Don't you wish you could do that to Brian Mulroney?
At the start of the campaign, Mulroney's Conservatives were 10 points behind in the polls, and Ed Broadbent's New Democrats were facing the prospect of virtual extinction. Turner had promised competence and a new Liberal Party with new people and fresh ideas. But the vaunted new team around him were late even in getting phones installed and computers unpacked at Liberal headquarters. It's that John Turner got stuck in the starting gate, traveling commercial for weeks because his organization was in a shambles. And in the heart of a Liberal riding, even filming a campaign commercial ran into problems.
You know what we were supposed to do? We were supposed to do this alone.
I know.
You guys are supposed to be the other side.
Exactly, but this is a public street. You can't stage something with the Prime Minister on a public street.
Canadians watched with growing amazement as the would-be savior of the Liberal Party began to fumble.
Now, you'll have an opportunity to debate when you can find a candidate who supports you.
Not only was Turner having problems reaching his public, he was increasingly being tied to the Liberal past. In almost every speech, Mulrooney raised Turner's patronage deal with Trudeau.
The Honorable 𝕿𝖍𝖊. He became the ambassador to the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, 88,009. It could have been worse. It almost was Ireland.
For a while, though, it appeared that Mulrooney had blown a winning issue. Talking with reporters about Bryce Mackessy's patronage plum in Portugal, he said there's no whore like an old whore. If he, Mulrooney, had been a Liberal, he would have put his nose in the trough just like the rest of them. 4 days later, Mulrooney had to apologize.
I do not deny having made these remarks, but I say simply they were made without serious intent, since they clearly do not represent either my attitudes or my position with respect to this important matter of public policy.
But by this time, Turner was in trouble again.
Let's hear for British Columbia.
That's known as mano a womano.
A lot of Canadians were angered by Turner's bum patting, but the Prime Minister refused even to concede that the gesture might be out of place in the 1980s.
I'm a very tactile politician. I slap a lot of shoulders and hug a lot of people.
What about female behinds?
Oh, goodness, I think people are losing their sense of humor. Je suis un nouvel homme, Monsieur Mulrooney.
It took the television debates to seal Turner's fate. In the French language version, it was Mulrooney who demonstrated that he was more in tune with Quebec. And next night, in the English debate, Turner made a fatal mistake.
On the basis of what you've talked about getting your nose in the public trough, that
he handed the patronage issue right back to Mulrooney.
If I felt I owed it to the Canadian people, and I did, an apology for bantering about the subject, you, sir, owe the Canadian people a deep apology for having indulged in that kind of practice with those kinds of appointments.
Well, I've told you and told the Canadian people, Mr. Mulrooney, that I had no option.
Well,
Truman, your next question.
You had an option, sir. You could have said, I am not going to do it. That, sir, if I may say respectfully, that is not good enough for Canadians.
I had no option if I was able
That is an avowal of failure.
It was a giant blunder, and Mulrooney never let Turner forget it.
I had no option. I had no option. I had no option. The devil made me do it.
Turner was never able to shake his image as a captive of the old regime, an image that hardened when he brought back Trudeau's old lieutenant, 𝕿𝖍𝖊, to try to save the Liberal campaign. It was far too late. The Liberals were collapsing. By mid-August, all Mulrooney had to do was sound as progressive as the Liberals on social issues and continue to lay on the honeyed words.
And we are going to recapture that dimension of greatness, and together we're going to rebuild that hope and that sense of prosperity, and in the process, we're going to rebuild a brand new Canada.
If the size of the Tory breakthrough was a surprise, so too was the survival capacity of Ed Broadbent's NDP.
In short, my friends, and this says it all, instead of voting for Bay Street, you have to vote for Main Street.
With NDP prospects on the rise and the Conservatives doing so well, John Turner was left sounding a little desperate.
I've got lots of faults, I've got lots of weaknesses, I've got lots of things I'd like to forget in my life. Like us all. Like us all. But I believe I have been honest. I believe I can be trusted.
The Conservatives are going to form a majority government, one of the strongest in Canadian history. It's a landslide. The Conservatives...
When all the votes were in, the Conservatives had a record number of seats, 211 of them, including an amazing 58 in the once Liberal fortress of Quebec. The Liberal Party was left in ruins, a rump of 40 MPs, only 10 more than the NDP. Canadians had given Brian Mulroney a sweeping mandate for change, a mandate to build the new Tory Canada.
David Halton is in Ottawa. He joins us from our bureau there. David, you call it a new Tory Canada. What's it going to be like?
Well, Peter, if you believe some of Mulroney's cabinet ministers, the Tories are going to be reshaping Canada pretty well from top to bottom. You know, the document that Finance Minister Wilson put out in November, the so-called Agenda for Economic Renewal, calls for a massive restructuring of the Canadian economy. Far less government intervention, far more unbridled free enterprise. But apart from the spending cuts and a few moves like changes in the foreign investment rules, for example, it's been mainly words so far, very few concrete actions.
Well, let's talk about that performance a little bit. It is past the 100-day mark now. What are people in the nation's capital saying about the new Mulroney government?
A mixed scorecard, I think, on balance, Peter. The transition certainly went remarkably smoothly. We saw Mulroney producing a generally perceived well-constructed cabinet very quickly, a successful trip to Washington to see President Reagan, and also the carrying out of a pretty complicated exercise, the mini-budget, in just 2 months. But there also have been mistakes. Even Mulroney concedes there have been mistakes. One of them was the excessive secrecy in the government's relations with the media. The other was the confusion, the extreme confusion over the handling of the government's planned review of universal social programs.
David, the political landscape of this country has changed tremendously in the past 12 months. The Liberals losing around 100 seats, the Tories a massive majority government, the NDP fighting for second place. Point us into next year for the leaders and their parties. What do you expect?
Well, I think we'll see the Mulroney government quickening the pace of change, particularly in the planned April budget, Peter. The Liberals will see beginning a fairly desperate search for new ideas and a new agenda, but not, I think, in the new year for a new leader. I think John Turner is pretty well safe until 1986. As for the New Democrats, they've been sounding remarkably self-confident recently. Ed Broadbent in particular sounding very much like a leader who wants to stay around for one more election.
All right, David, thanks very much. For millions of Canadians, one event surpassed everything else that happened in 1984, the visit of Pope John Paul. From one end of the country to the other, he reached out to Canadians, and you didn't have to be Catholic to be caught up in the excitement. Larry Stout covered the Pope's tour, 12 days in September, that gave us memories to last a lifetime.
He captivated Canada. For 12 days, John Paul II presided over the most spectacular roadshow in the nation's history. He traveled more than 1,000 kilometers a day, visited 16 cities and 8 provinces, attended 60 different events, a trip that took him from the rugged shores of Newfoundland to the shadow of the Rockies on the Pacific coast. It was a celebration of faith, a celebration of love.
Take, Lord, receive.
A celebration of Canada in all its diversity. It was hands-on spirituality.
Understanding my entire being. Give me only your love and your grace. That's enough for me. Your love and your grace are enough for me.
The pilgrimage began on a sunny September Sunday in Quebec, the cradle of Christianity in North America. John Paul II was the first pope ever to kiss Canadian soil. He was welcomed by Governor-General Jen Sauvé as a pilgrim of compassion and peace. The Pope quickly set the challenging agenda for his visit.
I would like to speak to you
about the issues of our times concerning culture, the community, technology, the family, sharing, and justice.
The tour was on through the streets of old Quebec. Along the way, doves, symbols of peace, were released into a clear blue sky. At least 200,000 people attended the Pope's first Mass at Laval University. Their enthusiasm set the tone for the rest of the visit. If the Canadian character is reserved and reticent, the papal pilgrimage generated excitement and emotion. At dusk, a crimson sky. The Pope distributed communion as candles flickered serenely. That's how the Pontiff's historic first hours in Canada ended. Canada's Atlantic coast provided some of the most dramatic backdrops for the visit. Icy winds and stormy skies kept crowds smaller than expected. But through it all, papal enthusiasm didn't flag. At Flat Rock, Newfoundland, the Pope raised a storm of controversy when he spoke against the pursuit of profits by a few at the expense of workers and supported the cooperative ownership of the fishery. Although the papal image was mostly one of gentle persuasion, other tough statements followed. In Edmonton, John Paul II thundered like an Old Testament prophet, assailing the rich nation's neglect of the poor.
This poor South will judge the rich North. And the poor people and poor nations will judge those people who take these goods away from them.
In Vancouver, a spectacular youth rally at BC Place. The Pope used the occasion to speak out strongly against abortion.
This unspeakable crime sets the stage for despising, negating, and eliminating the life of others, and for attacking the life of society.
While the Pope's views on sexual morality were conservative, his messages seemed to have the greatest emotional impact on the young. This was a scene at a youth rally at Olympic Stadium in Montreal.
Oh, it's terrific! I love it. There's a chance in a lifetime. I think it's great.
The Pope came to Canada primarily as pastor of the country's nearly 12 million Roman Catholics. But he was welcomed by people of all faiths. And hopes were high the visit would promote the cause of better interfaith relations. In Toronto, at St. Paul's Anglican Church, the Pope spoke enthusiastically about greater dialogue and understanding.
To assure you once more of our aim and hope to be able one day to remove every obstacle, every misunderstanding.
But in Edmonton, many people were disappointed when what they understood to be an interfaith service turned out to be a Roman Catholic ceremony to which other religious leaders had been invited. The Pope's homily on Jesus Christ as light of the world made non-Christian guests particularly uncomfortable.
Jesus Christ is the light of the world.
The next day, at the end of an early morning mass, the Pope tried to undo the damage.
We are looking and working towards the unity of Christians, but we are looking also to the non-Christians religions, to all the people who believe in God.
The Pope also used the Edmonton Mass to talk extemporaneously about his impressions of Canada.
Canada is a big country, a continent. It is sometimes wind, sometimes sunny, sometimes rainy, and rather windy.
But it was a persistent autumn fog, not wind, that led to the biggest disappointment of the papal pilgrimage: the scrapping of John Paul's visit to Fort Simpson in the Northwest Territories.
I will never forget you, my people.
More than 4,000 Indian, Inuit, and Métis waited in vain for the Pope's plane to arrive. It never touched down.
Of my hand.
But at an unscheduled stop at Yellowknife, the Pope did meet with some native leaders. And he also sent a message to the people waiting at Fort Simpson. A strong message endorsing native self-determination. If the cancellation of Fort Simpson was a major disappointment, the Pope's trip to Huronia and the Martyrs' Shrine near Midland, Ontario, was for him the most personally satisfying aspect of his Canadian tour. Flanked by native people, the Pontiff toured the restored mission of St. Marie among the Hurons. At a sweetgrass ceremony, he was presented with an eagle feather, the greatest honor native people can bestow.
This feather shall be awarded to you for your supreme courage. These are my words. 𝕿𝖍𝖊 𝖂𝖔𝖉.
At Toronto CNE Stadium, another highly emotional event for the Polish Pope, a Polish rally.
Wszystkie nasze dzienne sprawy.
John Paul joined the huge crowd in singing hymns of praise and patriotic songs. Toronto was also the scene of the biggest single event in Canadian history. 300,000 people filled a mass site at suburban 𝕿𝖍𝖊 Airport.
Basic quality that he has about him is his humanness. He stands out as a warm and affectionate man.
Here in the nation's financial and industrial heartland, the Pope urged that technology be used to serve humanity. Ottawa, final stop on the pilgrimage. The nation's capital was resplendent in autumnal colors as the Pope sailed down the Rideau Canal. Across the country, the Pope's themes had been the evils of materialism and consumerism and the virtues of love and humility. In Ottawa, at his final mass on the LeBreton Flats, in the shadow of the Peace Tower, he talked about peace.
It is necessary to protect people from death, millions of people, from nuclear death and death from starvation. It is necessary to protect from death all that is human.
It had been an exhausting journey, but the Pope was obviously satisfied. And in spite of some complaints about the cost of the trip to governments, so it seems were most Canadians. The country was left with a legacy of images that will be difficult to forget.
Larry Stout is with me now in the studio. Larry, when we look back at the trip, I think we can all remember what it meant to us at the time. But now, a couple of months later, what has it meant to Canadians?
Peter, I think it gave Canadians a greater sense of confidence in themselves. No other single event in our history gave us such a unique opportunity to really see ourselves, to see our regions and all their beauty and vitality, to see our multicultural mosaic and all its diversity and vigor. And I think it's made us a more optimistic nation, perhaps in a sense as well. Those papal images have made us more compassionate and more generous.
What about for Roman Catholics? At the time that the Pope arrived here, he said he wanted a dialogue between himself and Canadian Catholics. There was a dialogue, but what's it meant?
I think you'll see a more activist Catholic Church, more statements such as the one just over a year ago that the bishops gave on the economy. And this is going to be very interesting, Peter, especially in view of the political controversy that's going on now about, for example, the future of our social welfare system.
We all remember that last night in Ottawa as the Pope prepared to leave on his aircraft back to Rome, and he teased us by saying he'd be back because he'd missed Fort Simpson. Anything new on that? Will he be back?
Word from the Vatican, Peter, is that he's going to go to the American West, to New Mexico and California, sometime around June. And the word is also that he'll drop in Fort Simpson, so he'll be back.
Larry Stout, thanks very much. As there is every year, there was tragedy in 1984, and much of it was man-made. Sudden and violent death that struck in big places like London and Mexico City, and in places hardly anyone had heard of before, San Ysidro, Bhopal. In a world where leaders of great powers and small powers all talk about peace, there seemed to be precious little of it. In Lebanon, Shiite Muslim militia fought their way out of the hills around Beirut, hastening the departure of the International Peace Force. First to leave, the beleaguered American Marines, followed soon after by the British, the Italians, and last the French. Remnants of the Lebanese army joined the Muslims as they took over fortifications just vacated by the Peace Force. With Syrian support, they imposed a shaky peace. Later, Jordan's King Hussein tried to forge a moderate Arab alliance, first by calling on Egypt's Hosni Mubarak, and then by welcoming back Yasser Arafat 14 years after he expelled the PLO from Jordan. Elections in Israel gave neither winner Shimon Peres nor loser Yitzhak Shamir enough seats for a government. They finally agreed to alternate as prime minister, starting with Peres. In Moscow, the funeral of Soviet leader Yuri Andropov. He hadn't been seen for 8 months. Leading the mourners, his successor, Konstantin Chernenko. In the Punjab, Sikh militants led by extremist 𝕿𝖍𝖊 occupied the Golden Temple in Amritsar to back their demands for autonomy. Prime Minister Indira Gandhi ordered in the troops. 𝕿𝖍𝖊 and hundreds died. This led to Sikh rioting throughout India. 4 months later, Gandhi herself was dead, assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards. Her son and successor, Rajiv Gandhi, scattered her ashes over the Himalayas. Violence in South America. Millions of Brazilians demanded a direct vote in presidential elections. They did not get it. In Chile, military dictator Pinochet crushed increasing demands for a return to democracy. President Mitterrand of France got fooled. He had agreed with Libya's Colonel Gaddafi to a mutual troop withdrawal from Chad. The French left. The Libyans did not. In London, anti-Gaddafi demonstrators were shot at from the Libyan embassy. A London policewoman was killed. After a week-long siege of the embassy, the Libyans were forced to leave England. Also in Britain, unprecedented violence as striking coal miners battled police and later each other over pit closings. By year's end, some had gone back to work, but the strike was far from settled. At Brighton's Grand Hotel, the British cabinet narrowly escaped an IRA bomb attack. 4 people were killed, including an MP. Margaret Thatcher herself had just stepped out of her bathroom when the ceiling collapsed. Britain is giving up Hong Kong in 1997 when the Crown Colony reverts to Chinese control. The Chinese promise to keep free enterprise for another 50 years after that. In Poland, thousands of people chant anti-government slogans at the funeral of pro-solidarity priest 𝕿𝖍𝖊 𝖂𝖔𝖗, tortured and drowned by members of the Polish secret police. In Rome, Italian authorities have formally charged 3 Bulgarians and 4 Turks with trying to kill the Pope 3 years ago. Officials say this man, Orwell, seen running from St. Peter's Square, fired the second gun in the assassination attempt. A bizarre mass killing in San Ysidro, California. A man walked into the McDonald's across the street from his house and shot anyone in sight. He was killed by police after a 90-minute barrage. The grim total, 22 dead, 19 injured. In Mexico City, a huge natural gas explosion, blasting and burning a sprawling slum, flattening and incinerating everything in its reach. The first of the year's 2 industrial catastrophes, 100,000 homeless, more than 350 dead. And then in Bhopal, India, the incomprehensible, the unacceptable, the most hideous industrial accident of all time. A silent cloud of poison gas from a Union Carbide insecticide plant kills all in its path. At last count, close to 3,000 dead, thousands more blinded and crippled for life. The Nobel Peace Prize went to South Africa's Anglican Bishop Desmond Tutu. While in his homeland, it was another year of apartheid violence. And finally, the forgotten wars. The one between Iran and Iraq dragged inconclusively through its 4th year. And in Afghanistan, the Russians are no closer to controlling the countryside than they were when they invaded in 1980. From a forgotten war to the unnoticed famine, people were starving to death in Ethiopia early in 1984. But it wasn't until the fall that the world paid attention. Not until there were pictures on television, the pictures of pain and suffering. The CBC's Brian Stewart was one of the first correspondents who went into Ethiopia's refugee camps. He came back with the ghastly images that haunt us all.
Throughout much of Africa this year, virtually everything that could go wrong did go wrong, with appalling cost. It was a year of drought, famine, economic decay, and in a half-dozen countries, internal wars as well. Ethiopia caught most attention because of the sheer scale of its famine, which directly threatened 7 million people, and which may yet turn the country's north into a dust-blown wasteland. But as many as 20 other countries also faced famine, and continent-wide, more than 30 million people were in severe risk of starvation. Successive years of drought got most of the blame, but in fact 1984 represented an ecological disaster perhaps unique in this century. In Ethiopia, as in much of Africa, deforestation and overuse of land destroyed vast tracts of farmland even before the rain stopped. Undernourished, the land simply couldn't withstand a crisis, could in no way feed an ever-growing population. Drought, in a sense, was simply the latest act in a tragedy many years in the making. By early March, aid agencies knew an enormous hunger was about to hit many of these countries. In Ethiopia, they began using the term mega-famine, predicting deaths by the hundreds of thousands. But with a few exceptions, such as Canada, Western nations ignored the warnings. So did Ethiopia's ally, the Soviet Union. Only a trickle of extra aid had arrived when famine struck in full force this fall. Tens of thousands were to die in extreme misery before television pictures moved the world's conscience and an international relief effort was mobilized. So hastily organized, starting so late, that relief is barely managing to keep pace with starvation. In many areas, the attempt to move food to the stricken has been hampered in turn by the structural weakness of so many African nations. Weaknesses like the lack of roads, limited transport, chronic shortage of trained personnel. And weaknesses certainly of African governments themselves, who have in large part failed to develop agriculture properly, neglecting the countryside in favor of big projects and pampered cities. In one sense, at least, 1984 may have been a turning point. So enormous was the disaster that its bitter lessons are striking home. Black African governments have finally started giving emergency priority to expanding food production, to saving the land. 1984 was also the year aid agencies began to drive home their message that horrors like Ethiopia will be repeated time after time until long-term development becomes a world priority. For Western governments, there's the glum realization that Africa's crises won't fade away. There's no way to avoid expensive, prolonged commitment. Ultimately, Africa could feed itself, but the time left to correct its wasted ecology is now very short. '84 was a startling vision of what could lie ahead in Africa unless the spread of desert southwards is halted. For each famine gets worse than the last. Vast populations are being displaced, their search for food becoming steadily more desperate. And in 1984, literally millions were pushed to the very brink of starvation. As the year ends, it is still not clear how many of these will make it through the coming months.
Brian Stewart is with me now. Brian, as you said, the world's conscience has been moved by this horror in Ethiopia. But in the past couple of months, as it was moved, what has it meant to the people there?
Well, let's at least, the closing moments of the year, try and think of something positive. I think you can say this, that when the food finally did come in, it did save probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of lives. When we were there in November, no food was arriving at all, and they were predicting maybe 900,000 people were going to die by January the 1st. A lot of people's lives have been saved. There's a lot perhaps going wrong with the distribution of food, or at least some things going wrong with the distribution of food. But I think lives were saved. Those who contributed in this very emotional 2 months should feel that their food is getting through and making an enormous impact in a very tragic situation.
One of the concerns that I've heard from many of the relief organizers is that once this story drops off the front pages, drops off the television news, that once concern isn't there every day about Ethiopia, that the relief will start dwindling, that the concerns about Ethiopia will fade.
That's always a worry, and of course we always have to keep foremost in our mind that Ethiopia is just one of the many affected countries in Africa. It is a worry, but if, as I said in my piece, that if there was something different about 1984, it was perhaps the scale of the disaster was so great, and those scenes of horror were so intense, that perhaps it has shaken the world and Africa into a realization that we just can't go on every few years having this kind of emergence. We need a long-term commitment, not only in food, too. That doesn't really solve the problem. What they're going to need there is a long-term commitment to development. And I have some feeling that perhaps the 1984 horror of Africa might just shake the world into some kind of long-term approach.
Brian Stewart, thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter.
had an election in 1984, so did the United States. Americans gave Ronald Reagan 4 more years as president. He piled up a 49-state victory that gave new meaning to the word landslide. So there was no change in the White House, yet Reagan's re-election is a symbol of change. Deep, perhaps long-lasting change in the American people. Joe Schlesinger is our Washington correspondent.
All right. You've heard it all before about the American elections, how Ronald Reagan won because he was such a nice, look good on television, feel good about the future, standing tall as a leader kind of guy. How the upswing in the American economy made his victory inevitable because the presidential record books say that when Americans have more money jangling in their pockets, they never, but never throw out the guy in the White House. You'll also remember being told how the election might have been a horse race if Walter Mondale had only looked a little less wooden and wimpish on TV and had not promised to raise taxes. What you heard was true, but it wasn't the whole truth, not by a long shot. An election campaign is really only a snapshot. It gives us a pretty good idea of what a society looks like at a given moment, but it doesn't tell us much of what's going on behind the smile or scowl or how it got that way. The Reagan phenomenon helps tell that story. Here's a man who often doesn't know what he's talking about and stumbles.
The system is still where it was with regard to the progressivity, as I've said.
But that doesn't seem to matter to Americans. That's how decisively Reagan's personality and philosophy dominate the American political scene. It wasn't always so.
You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay, there is a point beyond which they must not advance.
Reagan, the great communicator, wandered around the political wilderness for years preaching the same rightist message. He was just as great a communicator then as he is now, but few would listen. He was considered then, even by many in his own party, at best as a bit of an eccentric extremist, if not a downright kook. It isn't Reagan who changed, it's the Americans. In political shorthand, it's called a turn to the right. But the turn has been so selective that using a purely political explanation could be misleading. Americans haven't all of a sudden embraced the anti-communist crusade of the right. They're not all ready to go galloping off to Central America to save it from the clutches of communism. Nor are they ready to abandon the more relaxed lifestyles of recent years for a conservative counter-evolution of sexual mores. They pick and choose. God, who a generation ago was being declared dead, is alive again in America. But the renewed interest in religion also shows a selectivity that defies political pigeonholing. Marriage, which a decade ago seemed all but on its way out, is back in favor again. But many of the young, while embracing the conservative institutions of church and holy matrimony, at the same time reject attempts to impose on them church teachings on contraception and abortion. There's a yearning for more stability and discipline in life, but a reluctance to surrender newly gained freedoms. The freedom of individual moral choice is hotly disputed by Christian fundamentalists. Organizations such as the Moral Majority haven't hesitated to take their doctrinal disputes out of the church and into the political arena.
And we could vote for any and all Jews, Catholics, Protestants, Independents, Democrats, Republicans, whatever. We just want to know where you stand on the issues, and the issues are the Judeo-Christian tradition and strong national defense and support for the state of Israel. Now, there's some other areas too, but that's where our people are.
The politics of evangelists such as Jerry Falwell is not driven by the usual political motivations, whether they be the selfish ones of gaining economic advantage or the altruistic ones of helping others. The main thrust of the Moral Majority is to impose its standards of a rigid, self-righteous morality on others. Its main message is no. No to the loosening of standards of sexual and social behavior. No to the egalitarianism of civil rights reform. No to any weakening of American superpower supremacy.
Jesus loves the little children.
The political message of the religious right has spilled out into the streets. Abortion or no abortion, prayer in public schools or strict separation of church and state. Those are the kinds of issues that arouse political passions in the United States these days, where activists once marched to save the whole universe from nuclear war or the huddled masses from social injustice and racial inequality. What brings out the demonstrators nowadays is a desire to curb the private behavior of individuals. Individual conduct, personal choice and advantage have become the prime political concerns of Americans in the 80s.
My love is bigger than a Cadillac.
It's among the young that you can spot the changes most clearly. They may still dress in the casual manner of the kids of the 60s. The drugs of the 60s are also still here, but the university campus rebellions of the 60s are gone.
People have changed their ideology because they're more worried about their future than people were back maybe 60s or 70s. I think they're more worried about what's going to happen to them in the real world once they get out of here, whether they're going to be able to support a family and do the things that they'd like to do.
In part, it's the recent hard times that have made the young so much more pragmatic and conservative. But there's also a deeper realignment going on, a reaction to some of the changes of the 60s, the civil rights and social welfare reforms which much of white middle-class America thinks have gone too far. In the 60s, the young marched for others, for the blacks, for the poor. In the 80s, the young stand for themselves. They and their country are interested most in getting on with their lives. Then there's Vietnam. You can't talk about where America is today without talking about the Vietnam War. Whether you're dealing with American attitudes to foreign affairs, drugs, authority, race, journalism, the military, flag and country. Eventually, you always get back to talking about Vietnam. Vietnam haunted the United States for more than 15 years. But Vietnam has finally been laid to rest here at the memorial to the Americans who died there. Vietnam veterans who suffered the neglect of their fellow countrymen as bearers of the shame of America's first lost war have been allowed to come out of the closet. Americans have overcome their Vietnam nightmare, and with it, many of their doubts about flag and country, and much of their reluctance to wield American power on the international scene. What we have seen in the United States in this election year was a result of changes over the years in the way Americans look at themselves, and a reaction both against the achievements and disasters of the tumultuous 60s. Out of it has come a more aggressively confident, self-centered, and conservative America. Ronald Reagan profited from the change on Election Day. He may not have brought it about, but he preached the message.
An early sign of some changes came today when he fired the finance minister, the railways minister, and law minister. But the government is still in transition as Gandhi gave cabinet posts to close aides and party faithful while keeping 14 ministries under his control.
Story began in a snowstorm in February.
Skies were right, went for a long walk, came back at midnight, took a sauna, got rid of all the accumulation of baggage, and just made up my mind.
That walk in the snow brought John Turner back into public life.
It is a moment for me to express my exhilaration at the results of this great convention.
The exhilaration didn't last long. After a trying month as Prime Minister, Turner went to the electorate, but Canadians wanted a change.
Our mandate is clear and precise. It comes with equal force and eloquence from a West too long ignored and a Quebec too long misunderstood.
Mulroney engineered the largest mandate in Canadian history. It was also the year Canada would have its first woman Governor-General, former Commons Speaker Jean Sauvé.
And duly and impartially administer justice therein.
I do.
The leader of the world's 800 million Roman Catholics visited Canada. Pope John Paul, always smiling, and with more energy than anyone around him, went across the nation reaffirming the Vatican's positions on birth control and women in the church. Queen Elizabeth concentrated her visit in central Canada. She brought that same regal splendor and gentle touch with the people that has marked all her visits to this country. There were individual triumphs in 1984. Inspired by Terry Fox, one-legged runner Stephen Fogno began his journey for lives to help fund cancer research. Fogno started on the cold East Coast in March and reached Thunder Bay, Ontario, halfway across the country by Christmas. Mark Garneau became Canada's first astronaut, conducting experiments aboard the space shuttle and earning the admiration of his colleagues, Canadians, and the love of his family.
He's already a star. Yeah. He's already a star.
Time in more years than anyone wants to remember, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers finally won the Grey Cup. In 1984, American politics was dominated by a battle for the Democratic nomination. It left the party bruised and divided. Jesse Jackson had taken a very large block of the black vote, and Senator Gary Hart had attracted the young voter. The nominee, Walter Mondale, had the task of bringing them back together. But the American voter affirmed the move to the right, re-electing Ronald Reagan with the biggest mandate ever in American politics. But America had its problems on the international scene. Troops were being killed in Lebanon, and the U.S. tried to shore up the government of Amin Gemayel. Finally, under pressure, Reagan withdrew the Marines. Relations between the United States and the Soviet Union reached a new low in 1984. For the first time since the Second World War, the American president didn't meet with the Soviet leader. The Soviet leadership also changed this year. Yuri Andropov's death brought Konstantin Chernenko to the top spot. In the world's most populous democracy, it was a year of religious violence. Sikhs demanding some form of self-government took over the Golden Temple at Amritsar and were run out by Indira Gandhi's troops. And in November, Gandhi was assassinated by her own Sikh bodyguards. In the city of Bhopal, a poisonous gas leak killed 2,500 people and injured thousands. It was the worst disaster India had seen. Even the tragedy in Bhopal was overshadowed by the starvation and death in Ethiopia. Thousands of men, women, and children were trying to run away from a famine. The story brought worldwide attention, and a massive relief effort was begun. In Britain, coal miners went on strike in the summer. It dragged on into the winter. Union solidarity broke down, and picket line violence increased. In Poland, the solidarity movement seemed doomed. Then the death of pro-solidarity priest 𝕿𝖍𝖊 𝖂𝖔𝖃 rallied the movement once more. There were happy moments in 1984. Prince Charles and Diana, Princess of Wales, had their second son, Prince Harry. In Europe, it was the 40th anniversary of D-Day, and Canadians who fought those battles were back again, this time to remember. Medical science had successes and failures. In California, baby Faye became the first human to receive the heart of a baboon in a transplant. She lived for 32 days. And in Louisville, Kentucky, William Schrader became the world's second artificial heart recipient on November 25th. In the music world, it was the year of the androgynous entertainer. Michael Jackson's Victory Tour grossed millions and set him firmly at the top. 1984 saw the end of the Trudeau era and the beginning of Brian Mulroney's new government. There are memories of a religious leader and the Queen of Canada.
George Orwell immortalized 1984 many decades ago, and as he predicted, our 1984 was a year of change, across the country, across the province, and across the city. It all started with a massive swing to the right in government. Prime Minister Trudeau resigned after 15 years in power. John Turner was elected the new leader of the Liberal Party, but it was Brian Mulroney and his big blue Tory machine that swept the country in a landslide victory. While Albertans may have gained nationally by finally being represented by those in a position of power, we suffered a deep personal loss at the local level. Leader of the opposition, NDP Chief Grant Notley, was killed in a plane crash at the age of 45. It wasn't all roses with the economy either. The dollar fell to record lows against its American counterpart. Interest rates and inflation continued their roller coaster ride, and unemployment continued to hover around the 12% mark. In southern Alberta, farmers suffered the worst drought since the 30s, and bankruptcies there tripled. Unrest continued on the labor front, too. Lougheed's Bill 110 angered unionized construction workers who didn't want to see non-union shops. Plumbers, bricklayers, and laborers walked off the job, then were locked out, then abandoned their strike and accepted wage rollbacks just to hang on to their jobs. Over at City Hall, the big debate centered around the route of the Northwest LRT. For the first time, stores were allowed to stay open on Sundays, and even bars were given the right to open Grey Cup Sunday. There was pomp and pageantry at the Sarajevo Olympics when the mayor and his entourage paid them a visit to pick up tips for Calgary's 88 Games. But nothing could compare to the tremendous ceremonies at the LA Summer Games, despite a boycott by the Soviet bloc. Here at home, preparations for our games proceeded right on schedule, with the selling of the TV rights, the receiving of federal and provincial monies, the decision to go ahead with Mount Allen, and the development of Pascapoo and Canmore. Our crime rate dropped dramatically this year. Even so, there were several highly publicized murders, including the deaths of 2 baby brothers, the brutal killing of Karen Callender, and the apprehension of Tony Ng, discovered hiding in Calgary's Chinatown and charged in connection with a gangland-style killing of 13 people in Seattle. There were several highly publicized accidents, too. Grattan-Otley's small plane was one of several to go down in the Calgary area. A PWA Airbus caught fire sitting on the Calgary runway. More Dayliner trains crashed en route from Edmonton to Calgary, and a freight train went off the tracks as it approached Medicine Hat. On the Deerfoot Trail, icing on the Calf Rope Bridge resulted in at least 2 30-car pileups. In education, a judge decided there was enough evidence to send former schoolteacher Jim Keekstra to trial for promoting hatred against the Jews. In Calgary, the Public School Board came up with a hit list of schools to be closed. Above the skies of Cold Lake, the Americans tested cruise missiles, despite protests from across the province and across the country. On the home front, our Miss Calgary, Karen Tilley, was crowned Miss Canada. Calgarian Robert Thirst was chosen to back up Marc Garneau, the first Canadian astronaut in space, and the Jacksons came to Vancouver, where hordes of Calgarians went to see them. The spiritual highlight of the year was the arrival of the Pope in Canada and his visit to Edmonton. His message of peace and love comforted many who had suffered through a torturous year of change. The single most important event of 1984 was the national election and the huge Tory sweep.
And of course, what got it all started, Pierre Elliott Trudeau did what most people wanted him to do. He called it quits.
For 16 years, Pierre Elliott Trudeau ran our country, and an intense love-hate relationship was established. His rule as Prime Minister began with an attempt to bring peace between English and French-speaking Canadians. It ended with efforts to cool the military buildup of the world's superpowers. He took office in a tremendous wave of popularity called Trudeau-mania. But in the dying days, he was so unpopular, Canadians were throwing eggs and giving him the one-finger salute, a trend the Prime Minister himself had established months earlier. Trudeau's long-awaited departure was to clear the way for one of this country's largest ever election victories.
There were few surprises, if any, in the race to replace Pierre Trudeau as head of the Liberal Party. John Turner, who had yearned for the job when he sat as a cabinet minister, came out of retirement to contest the position. The race boiled down to a two-man contest between Turner and then Energy Minister Jean Chrétien. Liberal delegates opted for the Bay Street business connections of Turner's instead of attempting to win over the support of French-speaking Quebecers through the anointment of Chrétien. But little did Turner know that he would become the sacrificial lamb when it came down to doing battle with the Tories and New Democrats in the federal election. Never before has the country been more ripe for an election than Canada in 1984. With inflation at an all-time high, unemployment running rampant, and a misunderstood and sometimes hated Prime Minister, Canadians couldn't wait to cast their ballots and change the guard in Ottawa. The campaign itself was a routine affair, with John Turner's affection for ladies' bottoms being the biggest issue. In national television debates, Turner got eaten alive by Mulrooney on the question of political appointments, that is, giving half-dead Liberals plum jobs around the world. Turner attempted to squirm off the hot seat by saying he had no choice in the matter because the deed had been consummated by his old boss. But if anything, it showed his inability to take charge of his life, and if not his own, how could he run an economically uncertain country? In Alberta, again, the people voted en masse, rejecting Turner's faint promise to give the West a new voice. Like most of Canada, Alberta went solid Tory blue. Even in Calgary, the one-time popular former mayor, Rod Sykes, was unable to defeat political newcomer Alex Kindy. Calgary East provided the only excitement with several attempts to discredit and disqualify Kindy. It began at the nomination with complaints of foul play in the election procedures and continued election night with charges that Kindy was not legally registered on the voters list. The action forced Kindy to avoid voting altogether. So adding insult to injury, Kindy won the seat without using his ballot or his family's. He was invisible during the campaign and continues to be to this day. On the provincial scene, it's been a quiet year as usual. Albertans are too busy trying to hold on to mortgages and jobs to worry about or complain about the Lougheed government's performance. The Premier's decision to reinstate his high-priced advisor, 𝕿𝖍𝖊 drew opposition fire. 𝕿𝖍𝖊 was charged last June for allegedly misrepresenting a prospectus in 1979 while he served as executive vice president of Dial Mortgage. He pleaded not guilty to the charge. The provincial cabinet's $850,000 bill for air travel in the first 9 months of this year also gave the tiny opposition something to whine about. It fell on deaf ears, but the Premier did promise to cut back the airline budget by 15%, even though he felt it was a necessary form of travel to get to the people of Alberta. Independent MLA Ray Speaker is attempting to establish a new opposition voice with his representative party. The new group is far from setting the world on fire. It reflects Albertans' lopsided attitude toward provincial politics. On October 19th, one of this province's more popular opposition politicians died in a tragic plane crash. 45-year-old Grant Notley died along with 5 others when their plane went down 19 kilometers south of High Prairie. The plane was en route from Edmonton to Notley's hometown of Peace River. Notley was elected NDP leader in 1968 and elected to the legislature in 1971. He sat as opposition leader for more than a decade. As usual, there were testimonials from his friends and political foes.
Mr. Notley's career reflected a high degree of personal and family sacrifice for public service, both to his constituents as to all the citizens of Alberta. Despite the adversarial nature of the parliamentary system, all members of our caucus had the highest regard for Grant's integrity, character, and commitment to the province. For those who are not intimately involved in the parliamentary system, it is perhaps difficult to appreciate the degree of mutual respect that emanates from those of us who participate on the floor of the Legislative Assembly.
I've lost my best friend, as I think most people know, but Albertans have lost a great Albertan today. The leader of the opposition, and there's no words that can describe how we feel. People said one time that Grant Notley could have been cabinet minister or premier if he was in any other party, they told me. But he cared, that's why he was in the NDP.
Notley is survived by his wife and 3 children. He'll be remembered as a man they called the majority of one. On October 3rd this year, former Social Credit Premier Harry Strom died of cancer. 70-year-old Strom served as Premier from 1968 to 1971. He entered politics at the age of 41 and 7 years later became Minister of Agriculture under Premier Ernest Manning.
Mr. Strom gave a great many years of his life to public service in this province. He was a Christian gentleman in every sense of the word and widely respected and appreciated by a great many.
Premier Lougheed paid tribute to Strom, saying he strengthened the agriculture industry in the province. One of Calgary's more controversial and colorful politicians died of cancer on March 2nd, 1984. A number of civic, provincial, and federal dignitaries, including Mila Mulrooney, attended the funeral of 60-year-old John Kushner. Kushner held office in all 3 government levels. He served as alderman from 1967 to 1974. At the same time, he was a school trustee from 1971 to 74. Then he graduated to the legislature in 1975, and 4 years later went on to the House of Commons.
I believe that he was the most effective finance and budget chairman that the city has had.
And the reason for that had nothing to do with academic education or financial ability. It had a great deal to do with common sense, a great deal to do with remembering that every dollar City Hall spent came out of the pockets of somebody who had worked hard for it and probably needed it more than City Hall did. John never lost sight of that.
You know, he represented a point of view that it's important to have in any caucus, and him not being there will be a little bit of a gap.
The Kushner family's longtime reign over Calgary East came to an abrupt end when his son Jack got bumped in the bid for the Tory nomination. I'm John Gulka.
Census showed a drop in population in the city of Calgary. This was partly due to the fact that our economy stopped growing and people stopped coming here.
Calgary's economy remained in the doldrums again throughout 1984. Unemployment stayed high, interest rates were relatively high, but the biggest economic story of the year was the terrible performance of the Canadian dollar.
The dollar was the most dramatic economic story of the year. Unfortunately, its kamikaze dive was not a pretty sight, and it made for an apt twist on the old saying, another day, another smaller dollar. The Canadian dollar started 1984 above the 80-cent mark in American currency. But as winter turned to spring, it slid to 78 cents U.S. Then on June 5th, it fell below 77 cents. Later that month, it cracked the 76-cent barrier. And on July 12th, our dollar broke all the records it had set in previous days and hit 74.86 U.S., its lowest point in history. Money traders sat back and watched with resignation as investors kept dumping the Canadian dollar, not sure what moves the government would take to support it.
A lower dollar leads to some concern on the inflation side, but it also, however, leads to greater exports, greater jobs in Canada.
Despite our dollar's poor performance against the American dollar, it's important to note that it remains strong against major European currencies, holding its own with the pound, the mark, and the franc. The government had to raise interest rates to try to support the dollar, and while the dollar sunk to record lows, interest rates reached their highest point in 2 years, the bank rate peaking on July 12th at 13.26%. That was far below the 1981 record high of more than 21%, but it was high compared to what we had been getting used to. The bank rate had stayed below 10% throughout 1983.
Typical homeowner, $24,000 on a mortgage. It's cost Canadian business over $2 billion in interest rate cost increases. The question to the minister is, when is this madness going to stop?
Interest rates dropped steadily following the high point in July, and heading into 1985, the bank rate is once again below 11%. While 1984 may have been a rough year for our dollar and interest rates, it was a fairly good year as far as inflation went. Starting early in the year, the cost of living increase began going down. In March, the national rate dropped below 5% and stayed under that mark for the rest of the year. In August, Canada's annual rate of inflation dropped to 3.7%, the lowest it had been since 1971. That compares to 5.5% the year before and 10.5% in August 1982. The major reasons for the slower inflation during the summer was a drop in food prices, particularly for fresh vegetables. And price wars at the gas pumps also helped keep the cost of living from rising quickly. Calgary's inflation rate was often the lowest of any major city in the country, about 2% below the national average. We go into the new year with Calgary inflation at 2.3%. The national rate is 4%. When it comes to unemployment, though, Calgary is not doing better than the national average. The jobless rate here was above the countrywide figure all year. In May and August, it was 1.6% higher than the national rate. The lowest monthly rate in Calgary was 11.4% in July. In May, it peaked at 13.3%. Finding a job was especially tough for people under 25. Their unemployment rate was generally around double the overall rate.
We need money and our parents can't supply us for the things that we do need all the time.
Calgary's unemployment rate has dropped for 3 straight months in late 1984. The latest figure is 12.1%. The unemployment issue was a major topic in the summer election campaign, and when they were still in government, the Liberals brought in a major program aimed at reducing youth unemployment. They called it First Chance, a $1 billion project that would have given 100,000 kids jobs as paid apprentices. First Chance was to have started on October 1st, but the Liberals managed to lose the election, And the Mulroney government canceled the program. So far, the Tories have not announced any similar massive job creation project. They're concentrating on cutting the federal deficit and attracting more foreign investment. The Tories argue that those moves will create jobs in Canada. I'm Gil Tucker.
1984 was a bad year for Alberta farmers. In the south, farmers watched their crops burn up in the fields in the worst drought since the dirty 30s. Their average crop yields were down a full 10 to 25%, and Alberta Hail and Crop Insurance paid out a record $175 million. And if the drought wasn't bad enough, crops in the Claresholm-Cardston area were hit by an infestation of grasshoppers. The hot, dry weather proved an ideal breeding ground, and they spread rapidly in spite of extensive spraying. Livestock producers were hard hit too. When they were unable to find water for their stock, they started selling off their herds. The government finally came through with a relief program for cattlemen, but nothing was done for the grain farmers beyond crop insurance. And while prices for agricultural products didn't increase, interest rates and operating costs did, resulting in a 13% drop in net farm income from the previous year. In the northern part of the province, farmers staged a 2-week sit-in at the Camrose Agriculture Development Office to demand a 2-year moratorium on farm foreclosures. But like most protests, it accomplished nothing. About 70 Alberta farmers went bankrupt in the past year, and the Alberta Wheat Pool has an even more dismal prediction for 1985. They say the number of bankruptcies may rise by a further 30%. I'm Rhonda Holman.
On the energy scene, deregulation of the natural gas industry proved to be the highlight in 1984. Former Energy Minister Gerald Regan, just prior to the federal election, unveiled a new policy allowing natural gas producers to negotiate their own prices. The old policy had dictated that prices would be set by the federal government. That left Canadian prices non-competitive when compared to their counterparts in the U.S. The new policy has injected new life into the energy industry. Pan Alberta Gas Company of Calgary struck a deal with American buyers late in the year that will pump $1 billion into the Canadian economy up to 1996. The new pricing policy, if it was intended as a vote-buying gimmick for the Liberals, obviously didn't work. Shell Canada's losses in 1984 turned out to be Calgary's gain. In an effort to slow declining profits, Shell decided to consolidate its operations into one headquarters, making Calgary its home. 900 Toronto employees were affected. Some chose to come to Calgary, others took early retirement, or others found new careers altogether. Another big boost to the economy and the energy industry came in the announcement of a $3.2 billion heavy oil upgrading project. The Husky Oil Project was called Another State of Recovery by Premier Lougheed. It was made possible by government loan guarantees of $1.56 billion and tax and royalty holidays. The plant will produce 54,000 barrels of oil per day for shipment to eastern Canada. Construction is expected to start early in the new year. Dome Petroleum's problems refused to go away in '84. The Calgary company recorded a net loss of $4.2 million in the third quarter of the year. Efforts to raise $350 million through the sale of 100 million common shares fizzled. The debt-plagued organization was forced to ask its 53 creditors to waive the debt load. The stock market deal was part of a major debt repayment plan, allowing Dome to clear $5.2 billion in debts into the 1990s. I'm John Gulka.
At the end of 1984, there were several unresolved issues in the healthcare delivery field. The province continues to wrangle about hospital user fees and extra billing by doctors, and there is still no cure for the deadly disease called AIDS.
But some other problems were worked out, albeit not to everyone's liking. Although a new hospital was started in the Northeast and the Holy Cross was saved, not everyone was happy with how it was saved.
Calgary may have to make a trade-off, a new hospital for the fall of an old one. Construction on a 500-bed hospital for Northeast Calgary started last spring, with a completion date set for 1987. The hospital will help serve the needs of people in that area, but people in the inner city and South Calgary will have to pay for it, with a reduction of service at the Holy Cross. Hospitals Minister Dave Russell says there isn't enough money to renovate the Holy and build the new hospital, so the government planned to downgrade the older hospital to an extended care facility. That sent Holy Cross staff and area residents on a rampage to stop the plans, saying a huge section of the city wouldn't get proper care. More than 20,000 names were collected on a petition by the quickly formed Save the Holy Committee, and the public outcry worked, to a point. The hospital board and the province worked out a deal that the Holy keep many of its facilities, such as the emergency and coronary care unit, but phase out 250 active care beds. Members of the Holy Cross Society weren't satisfied. They say the hospital board sold them out, and they will continue to fight to keep the Holy fully operational. The society got the backing of 300 Holy Cross doctors, who voted recently not to back the board's decision either. Instead of blowing over, this controversy seems to be heating up, and the fireworks should start again in the new year. 1984 saw another major health care controversy, this one over the Canada Health Act. All three federal parties endorsed the act amidst a chorus of complaints from provincial health ministers. The provinces said the legislation would force them to provide more services with less federal money. The Alberta government was one of the most vocal in condemning the act, which makes it illegal for hospitals to charge user fees and doctors to extra bill. Health Minister 𝕿𝖍𝖊 said the province would rather absorb financial penalties than ban extra billing. It's estimated Alberta will lose about $18 million a year in federal health care funding because Ottawa deducts $1 for each dollar collected outside the Medicare scheme. Despite the government position, groups like Friends of Medicare continue to fight extra billing. They say it promotes one standard of health care for the rich and another for the poor. The provinces have been given 3 years to comply with the act. Money the provinces lose during that time will be returned if they fall into line. 4 Calgarians died this year from AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome, and 4 more cases have been reported. All 8 are said to be in the highest risk group, those who got the disease through homosexual or bisexual contact. The other high-risk groups are drug abusers, hemophiliacs, prostitutes, and Haitians. There is no cure for AIDS right now, but there is a test to detect AIDS antibodies. However, if antibodies are found, doctors can't tell whether the person is immune or if the disease is in the incubation period. But the test can give peace of mind to those who think they've been exposed. The Calgary Birth Control Association came under fire in February when they launched a controversial condom giveaway campaign. It was a classic case of bad timing, since at the same time they were applying for $156,000 in city money to operate their counseling and referral programs. The CBCA was picketed by a Christian group who accused them of promoting promiscuity. City Council eventually approved the funding, but asked the CBCA to correct its public image. Association spokesmen agreed they picked a bad time for the condom giveaway and canceled the program, but say they still want to promote male responsibility for contraception. The world's smallest pacemaker patient, Jillian Zachariason, made her media debut here in Calgary early in 1984. She was born the previous November, 3 months premature, and weighing in at less than 3 pounds. Jillian's heart was underdeveloped at birth, so doctors fitted her with a tiny pacemaker. The successful implant made international medical history. Another medical first will be made for Calgary soon, with the arrival of the city's first test tube baby due in January. The mother was one of the first 30 women in the in vitro fertilization program, which opened at the Foothills Hospital last spring. At least 5 pregnancies have been confirmed at the clinic. Ambulance service was separated from the fire department this year, causing some concern the reorganization may have reduced efficiency and increased response times. But according to the director of EMS, late response times were few and far between, and Calgary would soon have one of the best paramedic services in Canada. The NDP charged that lives were being lost needlessly in rural Alberta because of inconsistent ambulance standards. They suggested an emergency medical technician certificate should be the minimum standard across the province. But the government says it's up to each municipality to set its own level of service. I'm Rhonda Holman.
A controversial year this year in the city of Calgary. For the second year in a row, the Public School Board published a hit list of schools they wanted to close down. And for the second year in a row, the provincial government refused to increase funding and educational grants.
That's right, Brenda. But perhaps no area of education was more controversial than the pre-trial hearing of former 𝕿𝖍𝖊 teacher Jim 𝕿𝖍𝖊. 𝕿𝖍𝖊 will stand trial before a full jury next year, and if convicted, could be the first man in Canadian history to go to jail for preaching hatred.
Jim 𝕿𝖍𝖊, the former teacher and mayor of 𝕿𝖍𝖊, was charged with promoting hatred against an identifiable group. For over 10 years, 𝕿𝖍𝖊 taught his students that the Nazi Holocaust that killed 6 million Jews during the Second World War was a hoax, and that Zionism was dedicated to world domination. At the pretrial hearing in Red Deer last June, many of his former students took the stand to testify. And after 9 days of testimony, during which Mr. Keekstra's lawyer argued that his client did not willfully promote hatred, the court ruled against him. Keekstra's lawyer, Doug Christie, then tried to have the charges against his client dropped under the grounds that they violated Mr. Keekstra's freedom of speech under the Canadian Charter of Rights. The court again ruled against the former high school teacher. Mr. Keegstra has now been ordered to stand trial before a full jury next April the 9th. If convicted, he could be the first man in this country to serve up to a 2-year jail sentence for willfully promoting hatred against a specific group of Canadians. Tolerance and understanding was formed in response to the Jim Keegstra affair. The committee, during 1984, prepared 4 reports recommending changes on private and religious schools, Native Indian education, and multicultural education. The changes were designed to eliminate schools and practices that lead to intolerance. The committee also recommended a board to oversee teaching standards in order to deal more quickly with Keegstra-type teachers. The government's response to the suggestions is expected early in 1985. The teachers' union endorsed most of the committee's work, except for the idea of a board to act as a watchdog over their members.
There were a number of inventions, developments, and experiments in 1984, both in outer space and here on Earth. There was one space-age invention, though, that got a lot of attention, particularly in Alberta.
It happened last winter over the frozen prairie of northern Alberta. Despite years of protests, they finally went ahead with the first testing of the cruise missile.
The test began at an Air Force base in North Dakota on the morning of March 6th. A B-52 bomber left the base carrying 4 unarmed cruise missiles under its wings. Using the missile's guidance system to steer it, the bomber flew for 4.5 hours over Canada's frozen north, a route chosen because of its similarity to Soviet territory. The bomber stayed close to the ground, flying at 500 to 1,000 feet, as the missile would do in a combat situation. The plane entered Canadian airspace near the Arctic Circle and continued on for 1,500 miles to a target at the Cold Lake Weapons Test Area. The cruise missile had been aimed at an old Army tank about 20 miles north of Cold Lake, but the military has not released any details on how well it performed. They are planning to test the cruise missile again over northern Canada early in the new year. This time, they'll release it from the bomber. The next test will undoubtedly touch off another round of protests around the world, protests that will very likely end up being as futile as those that preceded the first test. On the day of that test, there was a demonstration at the Cold Lake base, about 100 people symbolically burying a mock cruise missile. Also on that day, an Ottawa court turned down an anti-nuclear group's legal challenge to the tests in Canada.
The tests are scheduled to last for 4 or 5 years, so the process continues. We've lost this round.
The protesters had argued that cruise missile testing violated the Charter of Rights guarantees of life and security. Despite the fact that his government agreed to the cruise missile testing in Canada, Pierre Trudeau spent his last months as Prime Minister in a worldwide campaign for disarmament. One of his last official acts before retiring was sending a letter to Moscow and Washington proposing action on 2 of Trudeau's disarmament ideas. He wanted the superpowers to restrict their movements of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and he asked them to work out agreements to allow them to check on each other's weapons developments in the future. As with most of Trudeau's peace effort, though, these proposals were politely received, but no action followed. A Navy man from Quebec named Marc Garneau made history for Canada this year. In October, he became the first Canadian astronaut. Garneau trained for 8 months for his space shuttle mission, spending many hours in simulators, also spending many other hours on the public relations work that came with his historic voyage. If Garneau had had to pull out at the last minute, a scientist originally from Calgary was waiting in the wings as his backup. Robert Thirsk was very happy when he first heard he'd been picked for that role.
One of my first reactions, of course, was whoopee.
Marc Garneau did not come down with any last-minute problems, though, and on October 5th, he became Canada's first man in space. The Challenger's 8-day mission started off very well. NASA called it the smoothest shuttle launch they had seen, but problems started popping up just a few hours after blastoff. Officials at Mission Control first thought they might have to call Challenger back to Earth early. The shuttle had lost some protective tiles, and the astronauts were having trouble with some of the equipment. They soon worked the bugs out, though, and overall, the Challenger crew accomplished most of its major objectives. They took electronic photos of Earth, which could reveal hidden deposits of oil, water, and minerals. And Kathy Sullivan became the first American woman to go for a walk in space. Mark Garneau conducted experiments on how our senses adapt to space, and he observed the effects of motion sickness in space. 133 orbits after blastoff, they landed back at Cape Canaveral.
For me, that was the voyage of a lifetime. It was an incredible odyssey.
And Mark Garneau took with him on that odyssey two particularly Canadian items, a maple leaf and a hockey puck. I'm Gil Tucker.
February 9th, 1964, the Beatles invaded North America, and their popularity is still strong 20 years later. The Fab Four's 20th anniversary was commemorated in assorted television specials, reissuance of A Hard Day's Night, new rock videos, and a number of radio specials. Life magazine reissued an old cover, and Billboard paid tribute in a special section that included the top 100 charts when the Beatles held the top 5 positions. Today, Paul McCartney continues to make music that is consistently panned by the critics, but record sales have the former cute Beatle running all the way to the bank. He's ranked as one of the richest people in the world. Ringo Starr continues to pursue a movie career. Musically, George Harrison has retired and has shifted his career toward financing and producing movies. Yoko Ono manages to find old John Lennon tunes regularly and converts them into joint albums, including her own material. But the most positive sign of Beatlemania continuity is the rising stardom of Julian Lennon, John's son. The lad has picked up where his dad left off, and he sounds so much like John, it's like a reincarnation. Ringo's son, Zach, has suddenly surfaced with a new band, and who knows, they may join forces one day with McCartney and Harrison's sons to form the second-generation Beatles. I'm John Gulka.
Pay TV in Canada has not been around nearly as long as the Beatles, and so far it has not been nearly as successful either. Pay TV went on the air in this country a little less than 2 years ago, and since then it's been a very troubled industry. One nationwide service, C Channel, has already gone out of business, and First Choice and Super Channel have agreed to stop competing against each other. First Choice now has a monopoly in the east, while Super Channel operates west of Ontario. Despite the problems they've been having, 2 new Canadian pay services started up in September, Much Music and the Sports Network trying to succeed where the others failed.
The programming better be pretty good. It better be pretty interesting stuff, or I think you'll find a fair bit of consumer resistance.
The next few months will show how much consumer resistance the new channels face. How they do in the coming year will also determine the future of pay TV in Canada. An eclipse of the sun provided some free entertainment in Calgary this year. It happened on May 30th, when the moon blocked out 17% of the sun for about half an hour in Calgary. The moon was fully in front of the sun down in the southern states, but even there, scientists called it an annular eclipse, not a total eclipse.
Annular eclipse means that the disk of this black disk is just slightly smaller than the sun's disk, and there's still a white ring all the way around it.
And just in case you missed it this year, there will be another brief partial eclipse of the sun in Calgary on July 22nd, 1990. I'm Gil Tucker.
1984 became particularly significant for Canadian Catholics with the visit of Pope John Paul II. It was the first visit ever of a pontiff to Canada. But it wasn't only Catholics who reaped the benefits of the Pope's visit, as thousands flocked to see him in stops from coast to coast, including Edmonton. Even more saw him on national television as the CBC spent millions to cover his every move. The Pope's visit rattled the conscience of many Canadians as he spoke out on abortion, Canadian minorities, the ordination of women, and the plight of third world countries.
Those people who take these schools away from them, amassing to themselves the imperialistic monopoly of economic and political supremacy at the expense of others.
In Alberta, thousands of Calgarians flocked to Armed Forces Base Namao. Many camped outside in the cool fall air to be sure to grab a ringside seat. The Pope's next stop was to be Fort Simpson, but foggy weather forced the cancellation. The extensive television coverage proved to be a hindrance as well as a help in getting the Pope's message to the masses. Most people chose the comforts of their own living rooms instead of fighting the crowds outdoors. Poor sales of papal souvenirs left the Catholic Church with an enormous deficit that parishes are still attempting to overcome today. I'm John Gulka.
As we have seen, 1984 was a year of change. Well, what we can see of the future, it looks like 1985 will also be a year of change, where many of the changes will carry controversy. By the end of the year, the honeymoon with the new Mulroney government was drawing to a close. The West was demanding payment on many of the promises Mulroney had made during his campaign. The Alberta NDP was facing a tough challenge, maintaining momentum without their leader, Grant Notley. The future of health and welfare in the city looks a little uncertain. At least the future of the Holy Cross Hospital was settled, and the future of a hospital in northeast Calgary was started. And locally, Olympic organizers are set to tender out major construction projects at Mount Allen, Paskapoo, and Canmore. Jim Keegstra is set to go to trial to face charges of promoting hatred against the Jews. Also, by the end of 1984, parents and the public school board continue to debate which schools should be closed and why. But to some, the most frightening inevitability of 1985 is the further testing of the cruise missile over northern Alberta, this time in free flight. As for predictions, the Conference Board of Canada predicts a slow growth year for Alberta, but opinion polls show consumers both here and across the country have more faith in the economy than that. Most are convinced their personal financial picture will improve by year's end, and most Albertans are looking forward to what a Tory government can do for them in Ottawa.
Premiere, Street Hawk at 6:30.